You have an idea you've been carrying for somewhere between 2 and 7 years. It's specific enough that you could describe it. It has a shape. You have thought about it in the shower, in the car, in the space between sleep and waking when the mind moves without surveillance. You have told someone about it at least once, carefully in a way that left you a little exposed and a little proud. And they said something encouraging, and you held that encouragement for a few days and then filed it next to the idea itself, and neither of them has moved since. There is a document on your computer or a notebook on your shelf, or both, that contains the beginning of it, 2 paragraphs maybe, or an outline, or just the title, which is good, which you still think is good, which you sometimes revisit as a way of confirming that the idea is still there. You have described yourself at some point as a creative person, not as someone who creates, as someone who is creative. And you have felt, without quite naming it, that these are the same thing when they are not and have never been. The distance between them is the subject of everything that follows. Not because you lack talent, not because the idea is insufficient, but because the thing that has been keeping them apart is not what you have been telling yourself it is, and the story you have been telling yourself has been doing a very specific job, protecting something that would not survive the alternative. The condition that produces this, the years of proximity to an unrealized thing, the circling without landing, has a specific mechanism, and understanding it does not require accusing you of laziness. You are not lazy. The amount of cognitive energy you have directed toward the thing you have not made almost certainly exceeds what you would have spent simply making it. You have thought about the idea more than you would have if you had finished it. The problem is not quantity of engagement. It is the direction of the energy, and the direction has been away from the page and toward the self-concept that the page threatens. William James, writing about habit in the 1890s, made an observation that tends to get cited as encouragement and rarely as diagnosis. He said that we are, at any given moment, the sum of our habits, that the self is not a fixed entity, but a sediment, a layering of repeated actions that have gradually been removed from the domain of conscious choice and deposited into the domain of automatic response. What gets left out of the encouraging version of this is what it means for the person who has made the not creating into a habit. Because not creating is a habit. It has the same structure, the same self-reinforcing mechanism, the same increasing difficulty of interruption as any other practice that has been sustained long enough to feel like personality. The person who has spent 5 years not finishing the thing is not a person who hasn't started yet. They are a person who has practiced with great consistency a specific relationship with their own creative potential. And that practice has produced a self that is entirely comfortable at the edge of creation, that knows every rock along the shoreline, that has never been in the water. James was also precise about something that makes this worse. He said that every time we make an exception to a habit, every time we allow the behavior to slip without cost, we undo not just that instance, but the structural integrity of the habit we are trying to build. He was speaking about the habits of virtue, of discipline, but the reverse applies with equal force. Every time you approach the work and then find a sufficient reason not to engage with it, you are not merely postponing. You are reinforcing the alternative habit. You are depositing another layer into the sediment of the person who is comfortable circling, and the sediment is accruing. James did not think habits were fate. He thought they were urgent. The longer a habit ran, the more it organized the self around itself. The more the not creating became not a behavior, but an identity. And identities resist revision in ways that behaviors do not. Think about what you actually do with the hours you have told yourself you would use for the work. Not the hours that were taken, genuinely taken, by obligation, but the ones that were available. The ones where the choice was yours and you chose something with lower stakes. Something that required engagement without exposure. Something that confirmed you were an intelligent person consuming interesting things, rather than a person doing the harder and more frightening thing of producing one. The choice was not made consciously. It almost never is. But it was made, and it has been made repeatedly, and each repetition has been depositing something, a layer of evidence that the circling is what you do, that the edge of the water is where you live, that the idea in the document is the thing rather than the thing's postponed predecessor. You have not been waiting to create. You have been creating the person who waits. And the person who waits has been getting more practiced, more settled, more fluent at producing the reasons every year. Nietzsche's account of what he called the will to power is not about domination. The vulgar reading, power over others, the Übermensch as conqueror, misses the actual argument, which is about self-overcoming. The will to power is the drive toward the expansion of one's own capacities, toward becoming more fully what one is potentially capable of being. It is not competitive. It is not about winning. It is the internal pressure that accumulates when a person's actual activity is insufficient to their actual capacity. The specific restlessness of someone who could do more than they are doing, and who knows it, and who has not yet found a way to discharge the energy productively. What Nietzsche noticed about people in whom this pressure is not discharged, who contain the capacity without acting on it, is that the pressure does not simply dissipate. It converts. The psychic energy that was organized toward creation, finding no outlet, roots itself into something that looks like its opposite: criticism, judgment, the elaborate evaluation of work that others have made, the exquisitely calibrated sense of what is wrong with every example you encounter, the sensitivity to failure in finished things that is indistinguishable from the inside from high standards. But that is structurally different because it requires nothing of you and confirms your superiority to everything you have refused to try. The person who has not made the thing often becomes, over time, a formidable critic of the people who have. Not maliciously. The criticism is often accurate, the taste is often genuine, but the critical faculty has been doing double work. It has been assessing other people's work and simultaneously providing the evidence that your standard is intact. Every piece you find wanting is a data point for the position that the thing you would make, if the conditions were right, would not have those failures. And this is comfortable in the specific way that untested beliefs are comfortable. It cannot be disproven without producing the evidence, and producing the evidence is exactly what the structure prevents. You think your high standards are the reason you haven't created, but the high standards are what you have instead of creation, and they have been serving that function for long enough that you've forgotten which came first. The standard is not the obstacle. The standard is the replacement. There is a more precise name for what is actually happening, and it comes from Jung's clinical work rather than from any theory of creativity specifically. Jung noticed that the shadow, the repository of everything a person cannot integrate into their conscious self-concept, accumulates specifically in the domains where the person's self-concept is most invested. If you have organized your identity around the belief that you are a creative person, then everything that contradicts that belief, the failed attempts, the abandoned drafts, the work that came out flat and recognizable and not quite what you meant, gets pushed into the shadow rather than examined, not consciously suppressed, simply not integrated. The information arrives and the psyche roots it away from the identity because the identity requires protection. What this produces is a specific kind of creative paralysis that has nothing to do with inspiration or conditions or the right moment. It is the paralysis that comes from having built a self-concept around a capacity you have not yet verified in the domain where verification is available. You are a creative person. You know this. You have always known this. And the blank page is the one place where that knowledge is at risk. Not because the page will prove you wrong, but because it might, and the self-concept organized around the belief that you could create cannot afford the experiment that would confirm or disconfirm it. So the experiment is deferred, and deferred again. And eventually the deferral becomes the primary activity, and the shadow of failed and abandoned and never started work accumulates at the edge of the self-concept, and what you experience is not the deferral itself. You do not feel yourself deferring. You feel the conditions. They are not right. The time is not there. The energy is not adequate. The idea needs to develop a little more before it can be approached. These are not lies. They are the shadow's vocabulary. Kierkegaard, who is not a psychologist and not a creativity theorist, nonetheless gave the most precise name to what is happening in the moment before creation. He called it dread, not fear. Fear has an object, something specific, that can be named and addressed. Dread is anxiety in the face of possibility itself. The vertigo that comes not from a specific threat, but from the unstructured openness of what has not yet been decided. The blank page produces dread precisely because it is not threatening in any specific way. It is threatening in the way that freedom is threatening, which is to say, in the way that responsibility is threatening, because freedom and responsibility, for Kierkegaard, are the same thing. The moment before you sit down to create is a moment of genuine freedom. You could make anything. The idea in your head is still perfect, still complete, still carries the full weight of what it was when it arrived. The moment you write the first line, the possibility space collapses. What you have is no longer the idea. It is one specific realization of the idea, with all the contingency and incompleteness that any realization carries. The gap between the idea and the thing opens immediately, and it never fully closes. And every creative person who has made anything has had to develop over time a working relationship with that gap. The person who has not made anything has not developed that relationship. They are still in the dread. Not because the dread is worse for them, but because they have not yet discovered that the dread is navigable. They have taken the experience of dread before creation as information. This is not the right moment. This is not quite ready. And the dread, which is universal, which every person who has ever made anything has felt at the same threshold, has been interpreted as a private signal that the conditions are specifically insufficient for them. This is the specific cruelty of the mechanism. The dread is real. It is not invented. It is not a sign of weakness or insufficient preparation. It is the genuine existential weight of freedom in Kierkegaard's sense, the weight that accompanies any act of real self-commitment. And because it is real, it provides a continuously available reason to withdraw. The reason is genuine. The experience of dread is genuine. The withdrawal, however, is not neutral. Every withdrawal trains the self to treat the dread as a terminus rather than a threshold. And after enough repetitions, the dread has stopped being a signal that you are about to do something real and has started being a signal that you should stop, which is the exact inversion of what it is. Here is where the argument reaches somewhere most treatments of creative block do not. The perfectionism is not a standard. This has been said before. What has not been said, or not precisely enough, is what the perfectionism is protecting. It is protecting the identity. But more specifically than that, it is protecting the specific gap between the self-concept and the self-evidence, between who you believe yourself to be and what the work, if it existed, would actually show. Because here is the thing about the work that exists only in your head. It is perfect in the way that the possible self is perfect. It has not yet been exposed to the friction of encounter with material reality. It has not revealed which of its elements were genuine and which were borrowed. It has not shown you where your actual range ends and your imagined range begins. The idea you carry is you at your absolute best, unconstrained by execution, freed from the specific incompetencies that accompany any real engagement with a real form. As long as it stays in your head, it confirms who you believe yourself to be. The moment you start making it, it begins to tell you something else. Not necessarily worse, sometimes genuinely better, but specific. And specificity is its own kind of exposure. The work will reveal which of your instincts are reliable and which are borrowed habits. It will show you where you think in cliches you haven't noticed. It will require you to solve problems you didn't know were problems when the whole thing existed only as an outline or an intention. It will make visible the gap between what you can imagine and what you can currently execute. And that gap is not a verdict, it is information. But information is threatening to a self-concept that has been maintained on the basis of unverified claims. Consider what you are actually afraid of discovering. It is not that the work will be bad. You could manage that, reframe it as a draft, a beginning, a necessary stage. What you are afraid of discovering is something more specific, that the work will be ordinary, that it will reveal in the specific encounter with your specific material that your taste and your ability have a gap between them that is larger than you have been imagining. That the distance between what you can perceive and what you can produce is not a temporary condition of insufficient preparation, but a genuine feature of your current capability, one that will require years of unglamorous, exposure-building work to close, and that cannot be shortened by more thinking about the idea. This is not the fear of failure in the abstract. It is the fear of a very particular discovery that the self-concept is ahead of the evidence, and has been for a long time, and that the evidence is now available if you are willing to produce it. Nietzsche called the state of a person who has organized their identity around capacities they have not verified in reality a kind of bad faith. Not the Sartrean formulation, which came later, but the same basic recognition. You are claiming something about yourself that the evidence does not yet support, and you are protecting the claim by avoiding the evidence. And the protection is exhausting in a specific way, because the energy required to manage the dread and maintain the deferral is greater than what would be required simply to sit down and write the thing. You are working harder at not creating than you would at creating. You simply cannot feel the work you are not doing. The unexpected application, the place where this argument reaches somewhere that will probably feel ungenerous, is in the creative person's relationship to other people's work. The person who has not made the thing tends to be a sophisticated and demanding consumer of the things other people have made. This sophistication is real. The taste is genuine. The sense of what doesn't quite work, what's been done before, what's reaching for something it doesn't quite achieve. This is not fraudulent, but it has a function beyond assessment, and the function is self-maintenance. Every piece of work you encounter that you find wanting confirms the standard. Every successful work you encounter that you admire provokes, alongside the admiration, a specific and usually unnamed feeling that you could do this, that you understand what makes it work, that the distance between where you are and where this is a matter of execution, of circumstance, of the conditions not yet having aligned. This feeling is not delusional, it may even be accurate. The problem is that it is unfalsifiable in exactly the same way that the exceptionalism described in other contexts is unfalsifiable. It cannot be tested without making the thing, and making the thing is what the self-concept is organized to prevent. Fromm's formulation of the necrophilos character, the psychology that prefers the fixed, the finished, the dead, rather than the living, the growing, the undecided, applies here in a specific and uncomfortable way. The idea in your head is not alive in Fromm's sense. It is fixed, it is finished, it is complete in a way that anything actually made will never be. And the preference for it over the messy, partial, exposed reality of the made thing is a preference for what is dead over what is alive. Not in a dramatic sense, but in the structural sense that Fromm intended, the thing that cannot surprise you, that cannot reveal anything about yourself you didn't already know, that cannot demand anything further from you. You think the idea in your head is waiting to be born. It is actually an alternative to being born. It is what you have instead of the work, organized to feel like the work's predecessor. Frankl's central observation, that human beings do not primarily seek pleasure or the avoidance of pain, but meaning, and that in the absence of meaning, a specific kind of emptiness takes hold, applies to the creative person's situation in a way Frankl himself did not spell out. The person who has not made the thing has not avoided suffering. They are suffering, in the specific form of the creative impulse with nowhere to go, the restlessness that has no productive outlet, the low-grade persistent awareness that something is being withheld from the world and from themselves. What keeps this suffering in place, rather than moving through it into the work, is not the suffering itself. It is the meaning assigned to the deferral. The deferral has been made to mean, I am protecting quality. I am refusing to add to the noise. I am waiting until I can do this justice. These are meanings. They are not empty, but they are meanings that cost nothing. They require no evidence, no revision, no encounter with the resistance of material. And Frankl's argument, applied here, is that the meaning organized around protection is always shallower than the meaning that emerges from genuine engagement, because genuine engagement requires the person to encounter reality and respond to it. And the response is where meaning is actually located. What is more uncomfortable than this? The meaning in protection is not just shallower. It is structurally organized to prevent the encounter that would make it deeper. Every layer of meaning you have added to the deferral, every refinement of the rationale, every additional reason why the conditions are not yet right, has made the deferral more stable and the actual encounter less necessary. You have been building a more elaborate and more convincing reason not to need what would actually satisfy the thing you are suffering from. The suffering continues. The reason for not addressing it becomes more sophisticated. These two things are not coincidental. They are the same operation. You cannot find the meaning of the work in the deferral of the work. The meaning is only accessible through the making, which is resistant and revealing, and often nothing like what you expected, and which will require you to discover, in the specific encounter with the specific material, what you actually have to say, rather than what you have been imagining you might say. This is not a comfortable discovery. The imagined version is better, in the sense that it is uncontradicted. The real version is better in the only sense that matters. Here is the complication, the thing that makes this harder than simply deciding to start. The dread does not go away when you sit down. This is the fact that most conversations about creative block carefully avoid because it is not encouraging. The dread is there at the beginning, and it remains through most of the first draft, and it does not resolve into certainty and flow and the feeling that you have become the person you believed yourself to be. What replaces the dread for the person who makes things regularly is not confidence. It is tolerance, a working relationship with the gap, the development through repeated exposure of the capacity to remain in the discomfort of not yet knowing what you're making without interpreting that discomfort as a signal that you should stop. This is what the person who has never finished anything does not have. Not talent, not ideas, not the right conditions. A tolerance for the specific discomfort of being in the middle of something unresolved. And the reason they do not have it is not because they are constitutionally different from people who finish things. It is because tolerance is built through exposure, and they have consistently, efficiently avoided the exposure by staying in the dread before creation rather than moving through it into the dread during creation, which is different in quality, more generative, and equally unavoidable. The self-concept organized around being a creative person has been protecting you from the experience that would make you into one. Not a creative person in the identity sense, in the functional sense. The person who has made things, who has the accumulated scar tissue of abandoned approaches and revised instincts and the hard-won knowledge of what your specific range actually includes. Jung's process of individuation, the ongoing uncomfortable work of bringing what has been kept in the shadow into conscious awareness, is the closest framework there is for what creative development actually requires, even though Jung was not writing about art. Individuation requires confronting what the self-concept has been protecting itself from. In the creative domain, what the self-concept has been protecting itself from is the specific knowledge of your actual current limitations, where your instincts are reliable and where they are borrowed, where your range ends and where you have been imagining it extends. This knowledge is not available in the imagined version of the work. It is only available in the made version. And the made version has to be imperfect to produce it, because imperfection is where the information is. The shadow in the creative domain is populated with everything you have started and abandoned, everything you finished and found insufficient, everything you imagined you would make and didn't. It is full of information about the gap between aspiration and current execution. Individuation, applied to this domain, is not the experience of finally making the perfect thing. It is the experience of making imperfect things long enough that the shadow's content, the accumulated evidence of your actual range, becomes familiar rather than threatening, becomes the material you're working with rather than the abyss you are working to avoid. This is the thing that years of deferral prevent. Not the talent, not the ideas, not the right conditions. The familiarity with your own limitations that can only be built by encountering them directly in the specific encounter with the specific material over and over, until the gap between aspiration and execution is something you navigate rather than something you flee. Epictetus, addressing his students with the particular severity of someone who had survived conditions that would have made most philosophical problems seem abstract, drew the line between what is in your control and what is not with more precision than comfort. What is in your control, your attention, your intention, the quality of your engagement with what is actually in front of you. What is not in your control, the outcome, the reception, whether what you make will be as good as the idea in your head, whether it will be recognized, whether it will justify the years of preparation. The creative person in deferral is almost entirely oriented toward the domain outside control. They are waiting for conditions they cannot produce, for certainty they cannot achieve in advance of making, for the guarantee that what they make will match who they believe themselves to be, and the guarantee is categorically unavailable. It cannot be earned by more preparation. It cannot be accumulated by more thinking about the idea. But the harder application of the dichotomy is not about what you cannot control. It is about what you have been doing with the domain you can. Because what is in your control, your attention, your intention, your capacity for genuine engagement, has been deployed consistently and with considerable energy toward the maintenance of the deferral. You have controlled that with great precision. You have paid close attention to the idea, attended to it carefully, kept it alive, and sufficiently developed that the work of returning to it never quite felt complete. You have exercised the will and the discipline the work would have required, and directed them at not doing the work. Epictetus would not find this surprising. He would find it the predictable result of misunderstanding which domain your energy belongs in, and he would not be interested in your reasons. The identity that needs to be revised is not the one that says you are a creative person. That may be accurate. The one that needs to be revised is the one that says creative people produce work that matches who they are before they have made enough to know who they are. Every person who makes things went through a period in which the gap between aspiration and execution was large enough to be humiliating, not challenging. Humiliating in the specific sense of being shown the distance between the self-concept and the current capacity in the specific material, with no guarantee that the distance was closable, and the people who closed it or narrowed it or found a relationship with it that was workable, they did not do so by finding better conditions. They did so by accumulating enough exposure to the discomfort that the discomfort stopped being the reason not to continue. You are not the person who cannot make things. You are the person who has not yet accumulated enough exposure to know whether you are. Those are different problems. One is a verdict. The other is a description of where you are in a process you have not yet fully entered. The idea is not waiting for you to be ready. The idea has been present this entire time, available, requiring nothing from you except the encounter you have been declining. And what the years of declining have been building is not preparation. They have been building the distance between who you are and who you would have been if you had started. That distance is real. It is not abstract. It is made of specific work you have not done, specific problems you have not solved, specific instincts you have not refined, specific failures you have not had and learned from. The person who started 5 years ago when the idea arrived is not you. They are the person you declined to become. This is not said to produce guilt. Guilt is easy to metabolize. You can feel it and then return to the deferral unchanged. It is said because the reckoning with what the deferral has actually cost is the only thing that produces the kind of urgency the James argument requires. Not urgency as motivation, urgency as accuracy. An accurate account of what you have been doing with the years and what the continued deferral is doing right now, and whether the meaning you have assigned to the waiting is worth what the waiting is costing. The idea is still there. But the person who will make it is not yet who you are. Whether that changes is not a question of readiness.